Thank you for being here with BPFNA. We welcome you. We are very happy to continue with this very important subject that moves us and takes us to think and to take action about migration, and especially in this the Women's Month, the road of women. We thank the Foundation Remmer that is helping us and supporting us to create it and thinking and dreaming in the future to continue to have this series of spaces of reflection. So welcome. I'm going to give the word to our director, our executive director, James Smith, who will be moderating this afternoon, and he will be leading this meeting. Thank you, Jimena, and thank you, everybody, for being with us and this evening. And I have the pleasure to introduce you to our director of the foundation, Luz Chagüendo. She's a specialist in psycho-spiritual care, and she has experience in subjects such as gender-focused transformation of conflicts, global therapy, migration, project coordination, and she's a facilitator of community processes with women. She has also participated in the pushing committee of Gen Paz, an ecumenic group of women who build peace, and she also participates in the board of director of our organization, our move, BPFNA-Bautistas por la Paz. And so it's a pleasure to have you here, Luz Amparo, and I want to give you the microphone in this moment. Thank you for being here with us. Hi, good evening, and thank you all for letting me share this space. I want to see if you're hearing me correctly. Can you hear me? If you want to put like a reaction or a sticker up there, thank you for letting me share in this space. I want to speak also a little bit from experience and all the challenge that we have lived here in Colombia. I'm going to speak both of from Colombia and Venezuela about a migration and how it was a situation that kind of came to us because of all the realities that we live here in Colombia. This subject of migration, and especially women, who I've already been working with women, but now there's this new subject of migration women. And so this experience, I'm also telling you from love. This is an experience that has gone through my life and the work that I do here in Colombia. So I'm going to share screen. So the reality of migrant women, the case of Colombia and Venezuela. A Venezuelan migrant woman who was interviewed at the border between Colombia and Venezuela. She said, well, there we go. I'm sorry. There. She said, well, there we go. That's the situation here. Since I got here, it hasn't been easy. As a migrant, we suffer a lot of disdain. We go through a lot of things, both in work and in everywhere. But little by little, we've been able to go through solving little by little or a lot what we can do. This is like a part of the reality of the women. So in this context of the migrant reality in Colombia and Venezuela, it is said that over 6 million people who are refugees and migrants from Venezuela are mostly in Latin America and the Caribbean. And this has become the second crisis of displacement in the world. Kind of like to get ourselves in the context and the reality of the scope of the situation of what's happened. We know other realities, but let's say that the situation in Venezuela has been one of the crises for Latin America, with this flow of migration with over 6 million people. 50% of this group and this move are refugee women who go to Colombia, because Colombia like becomes the first country that receives them, and the second one, 58%, are in Peru. Colombia and Venezuela share a border widely. It's 2,219 kilometers. That's the border between Colombia and Venezuela. It's a very close relationship because of all the situations that we've lived also from our experience as Colombians as well. Colombia and Venezuela have a very close relationship. Starting 2013, the poverty in Venezuela goes up or increases, and it's said that in 2019, 96% of the homes are in a poverty situation, and 76% are in a situation of extreme poverty. That's like a reality that starts happening by 2020. So this is because of situations that go with different contexts and things that started living in the context of Venezuela. And let's say that from there, it started happening. And so from this, that's where the migration that we know today happened. So the migration of Venezuelans, the most high fluxes were between 2013 and 2015 because of the whole political, economical situation and all the crisis that Venezuela starts going through. And this migration is in 3 different levels. Investigations and research has told us that is in 3 different levels. The first, a migration flows because of the situation. And in the context of Venezuela, the people who are business owners or professionals start leaving because they have a bigger financial power, and so they get the opportunity to get a visa to go to another country, and so that they start looking at the situation and they start planning to go to other countries. So professionals and people who have the capacity to be able to leave the country. After that, the medium class, so small business owners and technical professionals, people who have some kind of profession or they work for a company, they also start leaving to the close countries from around, because they have some finances to be able to take a flight or a bus going through the countries of destinations that are towards the south. And the third migration flow that we lived in this context were the most impoverished people, the people who didn't have like any kind of educational level, that lived in extreme poverty. And because of this crisis and there's no food, there's scarcity of food and health, we say that the bonuses and the food that the government was giving, they stopped giving it. So, but these people, because they don't have any money, they don't have any finances, they don't have families elsewhere, they start walking. So they start walking and they start drawing routes from Venezuela, especially going to the south of the continent of the Americas. So the destination would be Peru, Ecuador, Chile. Those are like the most normal destinations because they have more access to make it to these countries. And so add on to this that there is a crisis or the crisis of the receiving countries, mainly Colombia. Let's say Colombia, it's a particular case because of all the situation of conflict and violence, poverty, and situations that we live in the country and that we have lived throughout history. So this is something that was added on. It's a different reality that is added on to our reality, and so it all overflows, and there's like a lot of poverty and the access to rights and health. It's a lot more complex because we already have a hard social situation to resolve, and so this situation also sharpens the problems and the situations that continue to be lived out. Within the population, these are the walkers. So these are people who walk through the highway, the Pan American Road, going to the destinations that are, like I said, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, and Chile. A lot of these families are accompanied by their children, their wife, their partner, their grandparents, mainly in the first flows, because it was like by times, by seasons. So the first migration flows, it was the men to sort of look for some finances for the family. But then after that, because of the crisis, also women started occupying a high percentage of migration. And a lot of women walk accompanied by other people or other men, but some do their walks by themselves, which has higher risks that they walk through these highways, especially with their children. In the case of Colombia, we would have to check a little bit on the amounts and percentages between women and men as far as the parity of numbers. It's like a very similar percentage between men and women. So 49, it's 49 versus 51%. And there's not a huge difference, and it's pretty equal. And it's in agreement. And because Colombia is a receiving country, well, then the people go to different places of Colombia. And so these women start living in Colombia. So women are over 50%. We also have to say that this increase in the migration of women, one of the other reasons has taken us to talk about what we call the feminization of migration. Migration also starts having a face of a woman. So we talked a lot about how the feminine side of poverty, because it has the face of women, because of the conditions that a woman can live within these migration flows, what they face, the risks that they can take, all the factors, the multi-factors that women can have in these walks, in this displacement from one place to the other. We start talking then about feminization of migration. I think that it's not just in the Venezuelan context or in the reality of Venezuelan migration. I think it's a worldwide reality, how migration also starts having the face of women and children. And so that's also something that has been talked about in this season. Perhaps one of the most notable characteristics of women migration is how it's sustained in the continuous reproduction and exploitation of the inequality of gender in the frame of global capitalism. That's also something that we talk about when we talk about the feminization of migration, how it's still exploitation, inequality, and the stereotypes of gender, or even the gender roles, are given to women specifically to migrant women, and the works, the jobs that they can have, well, they still, the babysitters, the maids, the prostitutes, those are the least wanted works in terms of migration. Like being a migrant woman makes you, in some way, there's this scarcity in access to work, to worthy work, to worthy payment and wages, to good labor conditions and social recognition. And so women are still being obliged to get like less paid jobs and less recognized jobs, and all these stereotypes that we still have, which is putting women in roles that are like this. we're still producing the gender patterns that are persistent historically and that continue to discriminate specifically women. So the how migrant women are affected, speaking about Colombia specifically, and putting this reality up to 2020, knowing that after the pandemic, there are other realities that are still there, and how the pandemic exposed the violence, and how the most impoverished women, say, of these regions will live this. They were affected a lot more because of the pandemic, and as a result, migrant women were more aggressively affected during the pandemic because there were no jobs, there was no access to services, and so and also everything that is related to the violence of gender and the violence that is exercised against women. So it says that here in Colombia, 47 cases in 2020 were attended, and from 47 it went before, so before 2020 it was 47, and then by 2020 it was 3,040. So, and I think then after, with the pandemic, then the reality was exposed that the groups of women or the gender studies were saying and talking also about this, about women being the majority. So we've also seen cases like this case of a policeman of the army who kills a Venezuelan woman. So the abuse, the power abuse, is specifically against women and migrant women. So an army officer kills the daughter of a Venezuelan because he had a relationship with this girl. So violence is also there. So, and feminine murders are also happening, and the percentages are increasing. And between 2017 and 2020, sexual violence against women increased 268%, and the violence within partners 462%. Domestic violence increased 212%, and interpersonal violence 234%. So these are really sad numbers. They're complex for the reality and the population as well. There's a big subject with interpersonal relationship, especially in the Venezuelan culture, of violence and domestic violence against women that has been very normalized. That is just part of the culture. It's understood as, oh, well, that's what our culture is like, and that's how we relate, and this is how we talk to each other, this is how we communicate with each other. So violence against women and the violence within partners is very normalized. It's part of daily life, and because of that, the family relationships and relationships with children and teenagers are relationships that spring from violence, where there's very little communication. And in this case, in these percentages, migrant Venezuelan women represent over 95% of the cases. So that's also to understand a little bit of the ages, the ages that women have, the migrant women, for psychological and physical violence. Women are between 18 and 28 years old, and in 39% of sexual violence, the victims are between 12 and 17 years old, which here also, the underage girls, so teenage girls between 12 and 17 are still victims. Girls are victims of sexual violence because parents, like the father or mother goes to work, there's nobody to take care of them, they're by themselves. We have had a lot of cases like this where they have to live in a room, and then they're alone with their children, so they just live in a room, they leave them to the person who takes care of the house or whoever is living there. And let's say in those environments, that's where you see violence against the girls most and against boys and teenagers. The most common aggression place in all kinds of physical violence is their homes, and also the sexual and psychological violence, as you see there. And so again, the house and their home is the most dangerous place for women, and in this case, for the reality of the migrant women. In Colombia, there was a registration of 1,331 cases of human trafficking. 79% of the victims were women. Also, there's also this issue of not having access to work and sources of work makes women vulnerable to be exposed to works that to go out and babysit or house sit or different things like that. But it turns out it's people who are actually looking to make them into prostitutes. Or we've had the cases of women who have been offered to take a package or something to a different city, and some of them have been in jail because they discovered that the package was drugs actually. And even though they only go from one place to another within the city or nearby cities like Bogota, and they're like 8 hours by bus, but they look for migrant women to take this merchandise, and it turns out to be drugs, So this has resulted and women going to jail. The main activity is prostitution, besides other sexual exploitation, forced labor, forced marriage. Like some of them just open themselves to a partner because they're looking for protection and being with a partner in a relationship to have a home and food. And so this is another way for them to look protection. Out of these people, 217 were foreigners, and the predominant amount was of people from Venezuela, and 138 of them were women. So the statistics say that out of 138 women, 100 have received some kind of help, housing, transportation, documents, and 92 women have received like a different kind of help. There's many different realities that we can talk about how women are affected, migrant women are affected, but we don't have enough time. But I just wanted to highlight some of the most important ones. One of the realities in victimization in Colombia of migrant women is that the ones that are pregnant, especially the ones we call like irregular, like they don't have a document except for the document that was a special permit, that it's a document that Colombia has to regularize the Venezuelan population and for them to be able to have access to health and work. And that was a while ago, and some of these benefits are expired. So the women who are pregnant don't have, or they have a risk in their health, because in order for them to get help, there's a little bit more regularization on this subject. But in the last 3 years that we've been helping Venezuelan population for women to be able to have access to health attention, women had to go through paperwork and petitions for them to be able to get attention, to get medical attention, because they didn't have any access to any health unless it was an emergency. Not just for pregnant women, but for anybody, any Venezuelan who wanted to get medical help, they couldn't get access before there was this permit thing. And when this process, this documentation of a special permit to stay came in, that was that started last year, and is now in process of delivery of these permits. That's now they're able to have access to healthcare. But now the women who are pregnant, when they go to Colombia, they have to go through a whole process to get some help. So they get like an initial help, but then the rest of the appointments, they have to get requests through the public entities, because the state and the national entities, like, they throw the ball to each other, like, no, it's not for me, you have to take this paper there, and they have them go around like that. And so civil organizations and the UN organizations are the ones who bring help and legal help, and they look to accompany the women that are going through these processes. Also, in the subject of health, one of the difficulties for migrant women in the issue of healthcare is that it's not easy for them to have access to it, and much less in mental health. It's like pretty much impossible to get an appointment with like a psychiatrist or a psychologist, because that's a lot more complex. So there's also a mental health crisis. We know that migrant people are affected, and there's trauma that happens from that, and they're affected, in being uprooted, trauma, the loss of what they left behind, everything that this involves emotionally, stress, other places, other cultures, but they don't get any kind of help of mental health. They only receive that if they belong to some kind of civil organization or a church or any kind of organism that give this access to that kind of help or health. But it's not everywhere, it's not in all the cities, and not everyone offers that. So there's a crisis of mental health that the women are living through. So some records as well, 82% of domestic violence, which is also an issue of the reality of migrant women, and also here in this case, Colombian women. The issue of having access to attention when they're victims of violence, like there's this victimization to women. There is no clear route in how to help women. There's still bad information, so to speak, in the institutions in order to help women. So that's why these numbers are so high, because 82% of domestic violence is still in investigation, under investigation, which means that there's no advancement in these cases, because also our justice system is slow, it's corrupt, it's poor. And so it's like the cases don't go further. And so many of the women are just victims to the point where they become victims of murder, because they went and they did the paperwork, but because the organizations, the entities don't make it clear what's the procedure, then nothing happens, and the victim is helpless and they get murdered. We have in our gender observations, we have cases of murders towards women. 88.2% of the sexual crimes are still also in research and investigation. 6.85% are in trial, so a lower percentage in that reality, and 0.013% are being executed with condemnations. this is what we've called violence of gender, and we've called it a pandemic as well. It's a reality that is lived out, that is alive. Every day we hear a case, and every day we see more violence against women, and especially migrant women who are suffering a lot more violence, and they've been more affected. Their rights, because of the protocols, or in the walks that they do, they're abused, their things are stolen, and so they suffer a lot more through this. So talking a little bit more about the issues that these women and the families that they receive, who are the people who receive this, and this is a reality in Colombia, but also something that we've seen in our research, that is also a reality that in the countries of South America are lived. It's like a very similar in this affectation. It's a scarcity of food, because there's no worthy jobs. They're only informal jobs, therefore their food is scarce. And in the case of children, there's a matter of nutrition. The lack of work opportunities is what we were talking about before as well. Gender-based violence, that's the reality of migrant women. Raising children within an environment of violence, because of the situation that women go through in their environment, and the lack of attention to mental health, and because of not knowing healthy practices to relate to each other, it results in violence, and frustration is repeated that way. Another issue that this population has is that the loss of their documents on the road, especially families that walk, they lose their documents, or they get stolen. And so that makes it hard for them to have benefits or health or different things, because they can't do it. The impossibility of validating their documents, or to revalidate their studies in Colombia, that's still a challenge for the migrant population, and especially women, professional women, or women who have technical experience, but they can't validate their studies in the other country. The delays in the delivery of the permit, that is this permit that is a temporary residence for Venezuelans, it's still a challenge for the state to have this regularization. Up to May 26th of 2022, they had delivered 1,207,403 of these permits. There's still a lot to give out and validate, and there's a lot in the system, and people have to go back and redo the process if it wasn't right, or the picture, or their fingerprints. So a lot of times that people have to go back, and then the entities where they have to go for this are in the big cities. And so, for example, with the women that we work with, it was hard for them. They had to go like twice and to do this process again in order to get their permit to be able to stay. The cancellation of their nationality, that also happens a lot. Their nationality is canceled for any reason. And so even if they had that nationality, they had acquired it, then it's canceled out for they get divorced or different reasons. So for example, if it's a person who has their partners who's a Venezuelan, but they're Colombian, because they don't renew their nationality, then the partner also gets delayed, and that can expire. And so if it expires, then they have to pay a fee. That's a very high fee. So that's another issue that they face. And the issue of health that we talked about a little bit, and education, having access to education, especially for children, boys or girls. Say through protection, children have the right to health because of international protection, but that was a challenge for the schools because they were always asking for their documents. So, in order to sign up for school, you have to bring your visa, your passport, the documents, and they don't have a visa or a passport or a document because they just left their country. There's no way for them to get a visa or passport. But that's also the reality of ignorance of the institutions, the educational institutions, that they didn't know how to attend all this reality that had just come to us. So here's more statistics. There are about 7,431,735 Venezuelans. I think that amount has grown. And in Latin America, there are about 6 million people. In Colombia, until December of 2022, so this last December, we're saying that in Colombia, there's a population of about 2.5 Venezuelans. So this is an amount that migration from Colombia gives, but civil organizations, we always say that this is not enough. This is not reality. It's like their estimation. But us who are part of the centers, we think that amount is a lot bigger. And so now that in this new government that Colombia has, they opened the border with Venezuela, and with all the previous governments, it was closed because there was not a good relationship. And as the border opened, we believe that, or it's believed that the reality of Venezuela is improving, and that Venezuela is improving, that there's not going to be any more migration, that people are going back. And that is something that is believed, but it's an illusion, because after the borders were open, what we've seen is how there's been an increase of migration flows towards Colombia. Why? Because even though Venezuela is improving, or it's said that it's improving, the reality is it's different. Their economics are very unstable, and so people don't have access to work. The healthcare is very poor, and so what a lot of people do is, because they know the route, they go back and they do the route towards the south of the continent, and then they go back to where their family is, and it's like they start over. But at least right now, in the reality of the walkers that are migrants, we are receiving a lot more people, especially in the humanitarian house where I work. And another reality that is added on to this reality, this migration reality of the case Colombia and Venezuela, it's another reality that Colombia is living out right now, that is called the lid of Darien. So that's the place to go towards the US border. So there's a story that's being sold about the possibility of going to the States. And so what are the migrants doing, the Venezuelan migrants in their as most? But it's not just Venezuelans. That's the other reality that we have here in this area of the country at the border with Panama, is that it's not just Venezuelans who go through this lid of Darien, but there are Africans, Haitians, Ecuadorians, because the reality in Ecuador is also complex, and it's not just Venezuelans, but those who go through the jungle of Darien. This is a different story that would also be worth talking about in a different space, because it's a different reality of what we're living through from the walkers that do the route. Because this reality is you have to go through a jungle, and that has a different connotation. Here, there's a reality of migrant women of many nationalities, and it's a matter of exploitation and the coyotes and sexual violence, theft, death also, because they had to swim through rivers and mountains, go through mountains, and anybody would have to do hard stuff if they wanted to go through the jungle. So this is another reality that is very complex and hard. And so here is the reality of the percentage of transit that the Darien has, the jungle of Darien. So as you can see here, 56,717 women went through Darien, the lid of Darien, this jungle, up to October 2022. And the stories they tell, the people who go through here, the stories they tell, and in an experience I had a little bit ago back in December of being in Panama in a refugee center. That's where this picture is from, where they get there by boat. It's 4 hours by boat in order to go to where they go in a place, and they have to go through 4 hours. This boat is $25 to bring him here. Then they have to pay $40 to take them to the border with Costa Rica, and so on and so forth, in order to be going up. So this is a very harsh reality. And so it's a little bit of the reality of the women. This is a little bit of their reality. And so I don't know if it's going to be, there's going to be time, but I wanted to share a little bit of a video that is like a representation of the reality of migrant Venezuelan women in Colombia. So this is a video that we recorded from one of the women who we were with in La Paz.
Decidí venir para acá, para Colombia, porque la situación en Venezuela es caótica para una madre soltera y viuda más. Era muy escaso la comida. Mis hijas muchas veces se alimentaban una vez o 2 veces al día. Entonces, quise darle una mejor calidad de vida a mis hijos. Y vi que aquí había oportunidades, por lo menos para darle una buena alimentación, una vestimenta, no riqueza, pero por lo menos de que ellas estén bien. Cuando llegué acá, empecé a trabajar en champú y empanada. Después, o sea, dejé de trabajar por causa de la pandemia que nos afectó al mundo. Ahí duré un tiempo, bajo la gracia de Dios, que me ayudaban con los alimentos, sin yo pedirlo, porque yo digo que es una gracia de Dios porque no tuve que pedir, llegaban. Y allí empecé a trabajar en una casa de carne, a la cual ahorita estoy trabajando todavía. Al llegar aquí y saber de la casa comunitaria CEPAS, el recibimiento fue muy grato, muy bonito, porque me dieron una buena hospitalidad. Una de las cosas que es importante, ¿verdad? De que así como está esta casa CEPAS aquí en Mondomo, hubiera varias aquí en Colombia, porque de verdad ayudan a uno. Muchas veces venimos con miedo, venimos con temores, pero ellos con su hospitalidad, con su generosidad, con su atención, nos ayudan mucho a sentirnos seguros. Una de las cosas que yo decidí ser voluntaria en la casa CEPAS porque uno como venezolano entiende al hermano. Ser emigrante no es fácil. Al salir se arriesgan muchas cosas. Y yo oro por los migrantes porque yo sé lo que se siente. Muchas veces se siente una soledad muy grande. Una de las cosas que yo hago aquí de colaboración es llenar una planilla, cómo se llama, de dónde vienen, hacia dónde van, ayudarle por lo menos si necesitan vestuario, ropa, facilitarle lo que es la ducha, también darle alimentos. Yo me quito el sombrero porque yo les he preguntado a muchos que andan con sus niños y ellos me dicen para dejarlos allá, pasar trabajo, pasamos todo. Y no es la idea de que yo me venga y ellos allá. La idea es avanzar. Uno de los sueños que yo tengo es ser independiente, trabajar por mi cuenta, sentirme yo productiva, sentirme que yo se puede. Pero uno de los sueños de verdad que yo le pido a Dios es regresar a mi país en algún momento, porque no hay nada más bonito que estar en casa.
Thank you. This is something to see a face of one of the women, the migrant women, and the realities that they live and what they experience. So thank you so much for this space and for letting me share with you.